He will be remembered for making some great music, for being one of the greatest guitarists who's ever lived.
It's really rare to have great success in the amount of bands that Eric Clapton did. It's not a normal thing at all.
He did do a tremendous amount to promote the blues and get recognition for a lot of the blues artists.
Eric Clapton was born in 1945 in the town of Ripley, Surrey. His father was a Canadian soldier who had been stationed in the UK, but had to return to his wife in Canada as the Second World War closed. With his father missing, Clapton was brought up by his grandparents, who acted as his parents, whilst his young mother pretended to be his sister. He did not find out the truth until he was 9.
Eric Clapton had a very confused upbringing. His mother, whose maiden name was Clapton, was someone he thought was his sister, and he was brought up by his grandparents, including his step-granddad, whose surname was Clapp.
I think Clapton had a really difficult childhood and upbringing. He had extreme kind of loneliness and kind of confusion from a young age. He was brought up by his grandparents, believing they were his parents, and then he never actually met his father. And I think that had a profound effect.
Clapton found solace in his unusual childhood in American 50s rock and roll that had exploded in the UK. And although artists like Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly made an impact, it was blues artists like Freddie King, Buddy Guy and B.B. King that would be the biggest influence on the developing guitar player.
I think what is important is how influential the blues was on that generation of musicians. It's a fascinating kind of grouping of bands who all kind of grew up around Surrey. You know, Clapton is from Ripley in Surrey. Jeff Beck's from Wallington. Jimmy Page was brought up in Epsom. I think it's a kind of cross-pollination of music shared between like-minded souls.
When he was growing up, the blues were really the only sort of music for alternative kids to connect with. So the fact that a kid from London connected with the blues is not unusual in itself. What is unusual in Eric Clapton's case is how he connected and how deeply he connected with the blues.
The greatest influence of all, though, was the legendary Robert Johnson, whom Clapton would call the most important blues singer who ever lived, and to whom he would dedicate an entire album much later in his career.
There are these kind of very vivid stories that you hear, the Stones or Page or Beck leave school, get on a number 73 bus, go round to someone's house who they'd heard had got a copy of a Robert Johnson record or a Blind Willie Dixon record or whoever. So I think to the early impressionable Clapton, it's inevitable that Johnson would be prominent in his journeys into blues.
He's quoted himself that the aspect of Robert Johnson which got through to him was the fact that Robert Johnson seemed to be singing and speaking from the soul. It was the sheer intensity of Robert Johnson's music, not the man, not the myth, not that selling his soul to the devil at the crossroads and all that nonsense. It was simply that this music spoke to him like no other music would for the rest of his life.
Clapton honed his craft playing gigs in both Richmond and the West End of London. After making a name for himself with his talents, he was asked to join the Yardbirds after the previous guitarist had left.
Everyone is going on stage with everyone else, and all these kind of venues where everybody's playing and everybody's meeting everyone else. I mean, that's sort of how all these guitarists fall through the Yardbirds in very quick succession, because it's all kind of quite incestuous. I think that's partly why Clapton goes through so many bands.
The Yardbirds found success with their first studio album, For Your Love, but Clapton himself would leave after just 2 years. The band would become music legend, though, due to the incredible lineup of guitarists that would follow in Clapton's footsteps.
That's when my baby went away.
For a band who sold relatively few records at the time, the Yardbirds had 3 extraordinary guitarists in Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, although of course not at the same time.
You know I still love only you.
What a lineup. It's absolutely astounding. I can't think of another act that's kind of encompassed such talented musicians as the Yardbirds.
I mean, there was no rock guitar before. You know, the likes of Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page and stuff, they kind of set that bar for what we now call rock guitar.
So when you think about those characters, you think about Jeff Beck, the solo artist, Eric Clapton, Cream, the solo artist, and you think, you know, Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page. And to think that they were all in this band that kind of made these psychedelic pop songs, it's mind-blowing.
Clapton's decision to leave the Yardbirds was out of a determination not to go down a pop-oriented path and to remain committed to the blues. He quickly moved on to the aptly named John Mayall and the Blues Breakers.
If you look back to the Blues Breaker period, in songs like Have You Heard and Hideaway, you've got these very raw solos which are showcases for what he could do. And with that space that he was given in that group, that's where you really see the creative genius of what he was doing. And he was a very, very young man.
Clapton's time in the Blues Breakers would last mere months, though. He had befriended drummer Ginger Baker, and together with bassist and singer Jack Bruce, they decided to form arguably the world's first supergroup, Cream.
During the Cream time, Clapton probably was at his most innovative. It was during those days that he developed this thing called woman tone, which is his name for his guitar sound during that time. He'd crank his amp, select the neck pickup, turn the tone down, and what he ended up with was this big, thick, kind of woolly guitar tone that is basically what he was using during the kind of Cream days, Sunshine of Your Love. You can hear it, it just sounds like massive and kind of really thick, distorted, kind of fuzzy guitar sounding.
And they were seen as kind of very flashy musicians and quite kind of indulgent. And although that hasn't lasted, you know, that kind of music didn't stay in vogue right up until the present day, they were extremely influential in terms of that scene of indulgent, flamboyant rockers.
Cream became a global success, and Clapton's reputation as the undisputed king of rock guitar seemed safe, until a fan going by the name of Jimi Hendrix asked if he could join Cream on stage for a jam. His performance antics and guitar skills made Clapton leave the stage, asking Jimmy's manager, is he always this good?
It's almost impossible to evaluate the effect that Jimi Hendrix had when he emerged in London as well as his native America. This was someone who was as good, at least, as Clapton, who was steeped in the blues like Clapton, although not as much as Clapton. But he was also someone who had the showmanship and a cockiness and the swagger that Clapton would never, ever find. And he must have thought, not, oh, this is how to do it, because he knew that he couldn't. But he looked upon Jimi Hendrix admiringly.
Here is a guy who is young, who is hip, who is kind of exotic and doing something very unique and very special and quite extraordinary with the guitar in a way that they're only just fumbling towards. And I think Hendrix in London really changes things for everyone.
We went along to kind of quite a few gigs of Hendrix to kind of watch and see who this new guy was. I think actually members of like The Who went along as well, and the Beatles, just to check out this new talent. And I think as a result of that, it really influenced his style of playing. He went to America after he'd seen Hendrix and kind of, I think, started to change the way he was playing as a result of these gigs.
Despite their musical rivalry, Clapton and Hendrix became friends. There was mutual admiration between the two right up until Hendrix's untimely death. Clapton said that his death hit him hard.
When Jimi Hendrix died, Eric Clapton had actually bought a guitar for him as a present. And it was a left-handed guitar, and he was never able to give it to him.
Cream began to fall apart at the end of the 1960s, and they released their aptly titled farewell album, Goodbye.
Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce had towering egos. They couldn't get on. Poor Clapton, the mainspring of all this, was caught in the middle. And so, as they bickered, then the magic of Cream dissipated and just evolved off into the ether.
Eric Clapton never hung around too long with anyone, really. He just kind of kept moving from project to project, and you know, that's something that was instilled in him from his earliest kind of experiences in rock and roll.
During his time in the Yardbirds, Eric Clapton had befriended the Beatles' George Harrison while supporting them in London. In 1968, Harrison asked Clapton to contribute on his composition, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which would later feature on the Beatles' White Album.
At his peak in the 60s and early 70s, he was the guitarist to go to. I mean, his relationship with the Beatles. And also, I think there's a fundamental thing about musicians enjoying playing with other musicians.
John Lennon actually wanted Eric Clapton to join when George kind of went AWOL for a few days. So to have people like them kind of wanting to join up with them is kind of amazing.
Despite coming close to joining the Beatles, Clapton decided to go it alone and worked in the US on 2 solo albums, a self-titled effort and 461 Ocean Boulevard. Although it wasn't the first time Clapton had sung, now his voice was at the forefront.
I love his early singing voice very much. I think that he rivals Jack Bruce in Cream for that lovely, smoky, natural white blues take, which is, there wasn't really anything like it before. And if you think about what Mick Jagger was doing with his idea of the blues, that was so different, that whining American sound. In Jack Bruce and Clapton, you had a very London take, really, on what they saw the blues to be.
I Shot the Sheriff. His biggest hit to date would come with a cover of Bob Marley's I Shot the Sheriff, which his management convinced him to include on 461 Ocean Boulevard. The cover reached #1 on the Billboard chart.
Marley's version of I Shot the Sheriff came out in 1973. Eric Clapton moved like lightning. His was out a year later. And so it was as if he was waiting for Marley to record a song that he felt comfortable with.
It shares quite a lot of the sort of tendencies rhythmically with the Marley one, but one thing it's missing is the kind of the classic reggae kind of one-drop rhythm. It's more of this sort of straight-ahead funk groove that's playing in the background.
For Bob Marley, the fact that someone who was so huge in America and Britain covered his song and covered it reasonably faithfully was a gateway to the West. Clapton covering it gave him a remarkable chance. And it also shows how open Eric Clapton was to covering new music.
The 1970s were an incredibly prolific period for Clapton. As well as releasing 6 solo albums, he formed a blues rock band known as Derek and the Dominoes.
It's too late, yeah. My baby's gone.
Derek and the Dominoes came out when he was playing with Delaney, Bonnie and Friends. With Duane Allman, they felt they had a certain chemistry musically, and so that developed into Derek and the Dominoes.
I think Clapton formed Derek and the Dominoes to get away from the kind of starry image that was starting to kind of be formed around him. He was super successful by the 70s, and I think he really wanted to get back to basics and be all about the music.
Derek and the Dominoes produced just 1 album, but the title track, Layla, would become one of Clapton's most loved songs.
What will you do when you get lonely? No one waiting by your side. You've been running, hiding much too long. You know it's just your foolish pride. Layla.
Layla is one of the all-time Clapton songs. I think in terms of rock guitar, it's definitely, you know, his signature kind of tune.
The all-time Eric Clapton song. I think it's the one that everybody knows. Even if they haven't heard of Cream or the Yardbirds or Derek and the Dominoes, they know that riff. And for me, it's also kind of a definitive love song.
As well as being a standout riff, it's you know, it's very immediate and it's very concise, and it bridges the gap between, you know, his early years and the success that he would later go on to become, you know, later in his life.
By 1974, Eric had overcome his heroin addiction that had started during his time in Cream, but a new addiction to alcohol took over, as well as unrequited love for George Harrison's model wife, Pattie Boyd.
It's late in the evening. She's wondering what clothes to wear.
He was completely besotted by her, and I think that kind of ruled his life for quite a few years. As a result of that, we got some of his most beautiful songs. Wonderful Tonight, which is rumoured to be about her, and bits of the album Layla as well are written about Pattie. So I think she was a huge influence on him.
Clearly, the narrator of Wonderful Tonight is drunk. What the Muse thought about this drunken man effectively slobbering all over her and struggling with the car keys has never really been recorded. But you could see that that was a doomed relationship, and it would never last.
Eric was in love with Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. Harrison knew about this, but was surprisingly unfazed by it, and then eventually they divorced, and then she ended up marrying Eric Clapton.
And then she'll ask me.
His marriage to Pattie Boyd would last only 5 years, and he captured their continuing troubles on the album Behind the Sun, written with Phil Collins. It saw Clapton experiment with synthesizers and embrace MTV with his first video for the single Forever Man.
How many times must I tell you, babe? How many bridges I got to cross? How many times must I explain myself? Or I can talk to the boss.
Eric's drug and drink addictions were taking hold of his life, and she has also admitted to taking alcohol and taking drugs, but never the same level as he was taking it. And clearly that was the spark of their relationship which brought them together, and it also tore them apart.
I'm trying to be your forever man. I'm trying to be your forever man.
In 1991, Clapton was hit with tragic news when his 4-year-old son Connor fell from an open window in New York City to his death. Clapton wrote one of his most personal songs, Tears in Heaven, about his loss.
Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven?
Oddly, for someone who is so immersed in the blues, Eric Clapton has revealed very, very little of himself in his music. He wrote Tears in Heaven. He was explicitly about the unimaginable horror of losing your son. It's something that only those who've been through that could possibly explain or possibly understand.
Would you hold my hand if I saw you in heaven?
Devastating song, obviously, written after his son falls out of a window. And what's interesting to me about that track is that he used it as quite openly as a kind of therapy at the time. He got a songwriter involved, Will Jennings, who actually wrote the My Heart Will Go On for Titanic, to help him with the lyrics.
The track was included on Clapton's MTV Unplugged album. As well as being his biggest album to date, selling 10 million copies worldwide, it made Clapton return to his earlier sound of stripped-back blues.
I think he kind of surprised a lot of people when he did that, because that whole album was a kind of turning point and really helped the whole Unplugged movement to kind of kick off when MTV started doing that. His was the first really successful album, and Layla was kind of bluesy shuffle to it.
As well as a return to blues, in 1998, Clapton released My Father's Eyes, a song about the father he never knew. Later, a journalist uncovered that his father never discovered that Clapton was his son before his death in 1985, completely unaware that his son was one of the most famous guitarists in the world.
He never knew his father, as we know, and also his father never being able to see his grandchildren, his father having broken that family link. And Act Two is unusually open and emotional for Eric Clapton. And it's very interesting that he made a rare public statement several years later saying that he wasn't going to play those songs anymore, and that the emotions that he felt then were no longer relevant to the Eric Clapton of today. And I think that says an awful lot about him and about his ability to parcel up pain, put it in drawers and leave it.
Clapton has continued to release new studio albums and to tour extensively. His long list of former bandmates has meant he has had many people to rejoin on stage. He has even performed with Jeff Beck, the man who replaced him in the Yardbirds.
I thought that you'd be loving me.
He can still sell out 5 nights at the Albert Hall and embark on these tremendous tours. And I think it's leaving a body of work, a legacy of work over a sort of 15-year period that is as solid as it gets.
And I'm still here.
Eric Clapton's legacy is just that he is a fantastic blues guitarist, and that he was really firmly entrenched in putting, British guitarists on the map.
I was never waiting. I was never waiting.
He will be remembered for someone who understood the blues, like I think very, very few white British men have ever done. He gets it. He gets the blues, and that will be his legacy.